Moments ago, the United States vetoed a draft UNSC resolution blocking a demand for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. The United States instead circulated an alternative draft, as it is negotiating a UN Security Council resolution that proposes a temporary ceasefire in the Israel-Hamas war. Now, it's the first time United States draft the UNSC has mentioned the word ceasefire. Algeria has prepared the document. The vote comes as Israel prepares to move into Rafah, the most crowded city of the enclave, where some 1.3 million people. So far, on all the UN actions on the Israel-Hamas war, the United States has consistently rejected demands for an outright ceasefire. All EU countries except for Hungary have claimed and called for an immediate humanitarian pause in the war. So far, though, the European Union has struggled to form a united response against Israel's military operations. Now, the bloc's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, has said that 26 member states have agreed on a statement demanding a halt to the fighting that would lead to a sustainable ceasefire. The EU countries have reiterated their calls to Israel not to launch an assault on Rafah. Meanwhile, this is Gaza. A refugee camp in Nusayrat was hit by Israeli strikes. Gazans in the refugee camp inspected the damage and buried their dead after the strike.
What happened was that the Israeli forces targeted a house inhabited by civilians who had nothing to do with anything. They were targeted without prior warning. They were all young children.
The United Nations has sounded the alarm over the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza. UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees has released images that show schools and a health center in ruins. Just earlier, another UN agency said that the scarcity of food and safe water has triggered a steep rise in malnutrition.
I demand from the Arab countries that they act and put an end to the war against us. We are exhausted so much. There is no food or water, which means we are done with life.
Now, correspondent Susan Tehrani is joining us live from New York. Susan, good to see you. United States has just vetoed a draft UNSC resolution calling for humanitarian ceasefire. I want to ask you, how is this any different than Washington's own, what it calls, proposal of a practical ceasefire?
So the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, made very clear that when you talk for a complete ceasefire, then that would hamper current negotiations between the United States, Egypt, Israel, as well as Qatar, which is talking about a pause on the one hand and then the release of hostages in the other. So anything that happens at the Security Council will directly affect those ongoing negotiations. What's different with what's the U.S. is proposing to what Algeria is proposing and, the Arab world is proposing is basically a pause, the release of all hostages, and for Hamas to stop attacking Israel. Those are some aspects of it. What's very interesting is that the United States is also calling on Israel to not launch that offensive against Rafah. That's something that, we hadn't seen before. Moving forward, let's see if that resolution by the United States gets passed. I think there is a sense of desperation among UN member states to actually bring something to the table and constructive when it comes to a humanitarian situation with the Palestinians and those hostages that are still in Hamas captivity.
Absolutely. Now, it is important to point out here, it's the first time Washington, D.C. has used the word ceasefire in reference to Gaza. I want to ask you how much of this is actually going to seep through with Benjamin Netanyahu?
Yeah, Netanyahu has been very adamant that if they stop any kind of operation in Rafah, which is the main concern. As you mentioned, there are over 1 million Palestinian refugees over there. It means that Hamas has won because Hamas tends to hide in the civilian population. If the U.S. really puts the pressure on Netanyahu, then Netanyahu would have to budge one way or the other. But it's very important. He's in a very compromised situation. If he stops that offensive against Rafah, then, Hamas would seem like it was victorious. If he doesn't listen to the United States and the international community, then that's, another onus on Israel as well.
All right, Susan, thank you so much for getting us all those updates from New York.